where it gets a little controversial is that nuclear power must be a part of the discussion because it is another baseload source of power. In this country, we're not, and this is where I start to tread into ground that I'm not as familiar with, because working on 9 research projects at once doesn't facilitate a lot of time for me to read up on the details of nuclear power. But as I understand it, and as I've been told, and from what little I've read, in Europe and other parts of the world, nuclear power plants, new technologies have been developed to reuse the waste, to recycle the waste over and over again, taking that hot waste, and the reason why it's called hot is because there's energy in it. So taking that hot waste and recycling it, reusing it. I don't know how much that's part of the discussion in the U.S., but certainly it needs to be part of that discussion. And eventually, yes, there will be waste to deal with, but I'd rather take all of the political hot air that's throughout, not just Washington, but also in the state houses throughout the country, focus that energy and a lot of the funding, direct that towards dealing with something like, issues like nuclear waste and recycling of nuclear waste until we can turn renewable energy into a baseload form, such that eventually we turn off the fossil fuel power plants. But it's not going to happen. It just won't happen quickly. It cannot happen quickly. So that's my opinion. So I see 5 to 10 years as a CCS as a potential bridge, and then nuclear power as another bridge until we get to renewables. That's my opinion, as limited as it might be.
Big question.
Shall we have questions now, or shall we?
Let's hear it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, thanks, Brian. I have kind of a little bit different take, but I think as a scientist, we should be open for scientific issues. I don't gonna shoot proposals down because they don't sound good. I have a scientific approach to these things, but I have my starting point is a little bit different than yours. And I start actually from a thermodynamic perspective. So the Earth for me is a physical system. And that means, and if you're in thermodynamics, you can almost see the Earth as a closed, I say almost see it as a closed system. And by closed, I mean that the Earth gets energy and also sends energy out. In principle, there's also some loss of mass, but that's, I would say, negligible. Like, for instance, helium disappears. And the thing is that what we have been doing as humans in I would say, the last 300 years is the energy flow. Instead of using, for instance, mostly the solar-based, we started to dig in the carbon. So actually, it's like it's like a car driving with fuel, or driving but using too much oil, and at the end, your motor is going to be screwed up. That's how I see it. And so this fossil fuel, of course, is mostly is actually low entropy, is solar energy that comes in, and then is like, for instance, trees that become fossilized, so that's the name fossil fuel. So it's actually solar energy stored over a longer time. And the biggest problem, I think, is the following. We have, of course, the CO2 rising, but at the same time also, at the present time, we are using more and more energy. India and China are now massively turning on their industry. Also in Western Europe, for instance, and in the United States, the power consumption is still going up every year. And so the question is the following. So we are actually, in the United States, people are actually using more energy than they should be using, in essence, or more they usually use fossil energy, and I think it's unsustainable, and the unsustainability is also not only in energy, but also, for instance, in heavy metals. Like there are these rare metal elements that are mined at a very high speed, and they are not recycled. For instance, people always praise solar energy, but people often forget to mention how they want to produce the solar cells. And like, for instance, if you want to make a semiconductor, people use mostly either like elements like arsen, what you have else, cadmium, this kind of elements. And so these are very toxic elements. if you want to build, like for instance, silicon, you have to grow the monocrystal. So these are not very, they are mostly based on coal or fossil fuels, and they are also very pollutant actually. Now, what I think what should happen is that we go to a sustainable way of energy, and so the people think technology can help us out, but that's true. But the problem is, I think it's rather as a social problem. I think we are living in the past. Of course, in the Cold War, we had an economic system that you had the Western Bloc where you had a capitalist system, and in the Eastern Bloc you had a Stalinist system. And both systems actually were productivist. Here in the West you had consumerism. In the East you had they didn't care neither about the environment. You know, like for instance, the Russians or the Soviets, they had in Kazakhstan, they drained Lake Aral to grow cotton, also unsustainable way of doing agriculture. So what I think is, if we want to go to a sustainable way of living, I think we have a problem with our economic system. That's what I think. And the reason is that our economic system is a system based on profit. Like we want to make, like for instance, when you're a business owner, your goal is to make a profit, and then use that profit to make new commodities. And the question is that if you think about it, every time you make a new commodity, you use energy. And that's why I think you have an exponential growing curve, also demand for energy. And I don't believe that the environmental problem can be resolved without questioning actually the economic system. I think we have to go to a more collectivist system. For instance, you can say, for instance, here in Salt Lake, you have, like in the rest of the United States, you have suburbia. You know, everybody builds his home. But for instance, if you want to have a sustainable environment, that means you have to take care about the solar energy we get in. You know, and you cannot go to, the sky is not the limit, I think. So we have to take into account the natural limits of the environment, and that means that we have to do things on a more collective scale, like for instance transportation, but also housing. And I think there should be a very strong very strong drive to go to efficiency, because efficiency, that's kind of the low-growing fruit, I think, that can be easily picked. So I am in favor, in essence, for developing massively renewable energy systems. I think that it's possible to have a baseload also with renewables, and on a very short term, under one condition. And that's David McKay has written that in his book, actually. And that is that, for instance, if Britain and Sweden would have to be on renewables by themselves, it's actually hardly impossible. You know, he did the maths, and he proved it was impossible. The only way is that you have a very integrated system, like you have, for instance, solar energy that is captured, for instance, in the Sahara, and then transported over high power lines to Europe. You know, that would be possible. So I think the only way to do that is then to develop massively also this kind of infrastructure. And this would be also good actually for creating jobs, because they are productive jobs and not based on bubbles. So that's kind of my basic take on it.
Okay. I'd like to kind of talk about it as an economist, and I think one of the big issues for us is the issue of growth. And growth has in the past always been the way out of social problems. So instead of having to redistribute or having to remedy injustices, we just try to grow out of them. And the time, there is no longer room, there's no longer space to grow into. Therefore, we have to switch to an economy which no longer grows and instead has massive redistributions of income. And these redistributions of income can also be justified just simply by the fact that the industrialized nations have been the sources of the CO2 in the atmosphere, and they are inflicting heavy damage on the developing nations.